The call came in at 1:04 in the morning on the 14th of February, and it came in on the landline, which is the part that told me everything before I ever heard her voice. Nobody calls that phone. It hangs on the kitchen wall by the back door, avocado green, cord stretched out and kinked from 30 years of my wife dragging it to the stove. I keep it because Marianne kept it. The only calls it gets anymore are the ones about my car's extended warranty. I was awake anyway. 68 years old and I sleep in 90-minute pieces now. Like a man still working rotating shifts 12 years after they cut the cake and gave me the plaque. I was sitting at the kitchen table with a cold cup of coffee and a jigsaw puzzle of the Split Rock Lighthouse that I'd been not finishing since Thanksgiving. Outside, the freezing rain was coming down on Lake Superior the way it does in February. Quiet, no wind behind it, just a slow silver varnish going over everything in the world. The phone rang twice. I picked it up, and my daughter said 4 words I hadn't heard out of her mouth in 22 years. 904. Heavy. Then the line went dead. I want to tell you what I did, because I've thought about it a lot since, and I still don't have a good answer. For about 3 seconds, I didn't do anything. I stood there with that green receiver against my ear listening to the dial tone. My hands weren't shaking. That's the thing people get wrong. When it's real, your hands don't shake. Your hands go quiet and cold and useful, and your mind goes somewhere about 4 feet behind your own head and watches. 34 years I sat in front of a radar scope. Hired in the class right after the strike, 22 years old, no idea what I'd signed up for. 26 of those years at the center down in Farmington, the last 8 up in the tower here in Duluth. Then the FAA aged me out at 56, the way they age everybody out, and handed me a whole second life I hadn't planned for. People assume the job is about airplanes. It isn't. The job is about voices. You never see the pilot. You never see the airplane, not really, just a data block on a screen. A call sign and an altitude and a little vector line predicting a future that hasn't happened yet. All you have is a voice in your headset. And the voice is always calm. Because they train them to be calm. Because calm is the only professional currency any of us have up there. So you learn to hear underneath it. You learn the specific flatness that comes into a man's voice when he's watching a gauge do something it isn't supposed to do. You learn the half-beat pause before a readback that means he heard you but he isn't sure he can comply. You learn that people in trouble get more polite, not less. In 34 years I never once had a pilot scream. I had 2 of them die, and neither one raised his voice. I put on my boots, I got my keys. I did not call 911, and I have had to sit with that. My daughter's name is Nora. She was 11 years old the winter we made that code. She'd walked home from school the long way, down along the creek, and a man in a brown Buick had rolled alongside her for 3 blocks talking to her through the passenger window. Nothing happened. That's what everyone kept saying afterward. Nothing happened. Like it was a comfort. She got home and she came in the door and she stood in the kitchen and she opened her mouth and nothing came out. Not a scream. Not a word. She just stood there with her mittens on, opening and closing her mouth like a fish on a dock. Later that night she came and sat on the edge of the bathtub while I shaved, the way she used to when she was little. She said, "Dad, what happens if it's bad and I can't talk?" I didn't have anything wise to say, so I gave her what I had, which was the job. I told her that in my world, when everything's coming apart, you don't explain. You don't tell the story. You say one thing and everybody on the frequency clears out of your way and starts helping. I told her about call signs. I told her that a heavy aircraft is a big one that leaves a wake behind it that can flip whatever's following too close. Her birthday is September 4th, 9:04. We made it right there, sitting on the edge of the tub with shaving cream on half my face. 904 heavy. It meant, this is me, it's big, don't ask, come now. She was 11, she thought it was a game. She used it twice that year for nothing, once because she'd seen a bat in the garage. Marianne told me I was building a child who'd cry wolf, and I said good, let her cry wolf 1,000 times. That's 1,000 times she opened her mouth. Then she grew up, and she went to nursing school, and she got married, and she stopped needing it, and I honestly, truly forgot the words existed until I heard them come out of the wall phone in my kitchen at 1:04 in the morning. 22 years. She never used it once. The drive from my place off Leicester River Road out to the house in Congdon is 14 minutes on a dry night in July. That night it took me 31, and the reason it took 31 is that the whole city was under a 1/4 inch of glaze. And I had a Ford Ranger with 210,000 miles on it, and rear tires that had maybe one more winter in them if I was polite. I remember going down Superior Street with my hands at 10 and 2, and thinking about how I'd never once in 34 years let a voice hear me hurry. I called her cell at the first light, straight to voicemail. Called again at the second, same. Then I called Kowalski, my neighbor, 71 years old, 30 years, a court reporter in St. Louis County before her hands quit on her. She picked up on the fourth ring sounding perfectly awake, which she always does, because I don't think that woman has ever actually been asleep. I said, Nora used the code. Dot didn't say what code. She'd heard the story at a 4th of July picnic in 1998 and she'd filed it, because that's what she does, she files things. She said, Kongdon or the hospital. House, I'll be behind you. That was the whole conversation. 12 seconds, maybe. I've had longer conversations with a drive-through. Here's the part I've never been able to say cleanly, so I'll just say it badly. I knew, not that night, before, months before, years before, in that soft rotten way where you know something and you've built a nice little shed out back of your mind to keep it in. I knew because of the 4th of July cookout at my house 18 months earlier, when it was 84 degrees and my daughter wore a chambray shirt buttoned to the wrist and rolled the cuffs down twice when she thought no one was looking. I knew because of the way my grandson Theo went still. Theo is 8. He was born deaf in his right ear. Not deaf, not the whole world, just the one side, and he wears a little processor behind that ear that's the color of an old nickel. The audiologist explained to us once that kids with single-sided deafness get very good at watching. They can't triangulate a sound, so they read the room instead. They watch faces. They watch shoulders. And every time Bryce Whitaker's voice went even slightly flat, my grandson would reach up and pull that processor out of his ear and close his fist around it. 8 years old, and he had figured out how to leave a room without leaving it. I saw him do that at Thanksgiving. 9 of us at the table, and Bryce Whitaker leaned back in my dining room chair and said, to the whole room in the friendliest voice you ever heard, Nora, honey, tell them what you paid for Theo's snow boots. Go on, tell them. And she laughed. She actually laughed. She said something about how she was hopeless with money, and everybody chuckled, and my daughter got up and started clearing plates that weren't finished. He didn't yell. Not once, not ever, not in front of me. He was pleasant. He had a big open face and a golf handicap and a firm handshake, and he remembered the names of everybody's kids. He was the top producing real estate broker in the Northland 3 years running, and there was a bench downtown with his face on it. I watched my daughter carry those plates into the kitchen, and I watched her hands and I saw them shaking, and I turned back to the table and I asked my brother-in-law about his boat. That's what I did. I asked about the boat. I told myself I was respecting her marriage. I told myself that keeping the peace was the same as keeping her safe. If you're listening to this right now and you have ever sat in a car in a parking lot, going through every small moment you decided not to look at directly, then you already know exactly what that drive down Superior Street felt like, and I don't have to describe it to you. The porch light was on at the house on Greysolon Road, her Subaru in the driveway with an inch of ice on it. Theo's snow shovel, the little red plastic one, tipped over on the walk. I cut my headlights and sat. Even through the storm and through the glass I could hear him, not words. Just the shape of a man's voice going up a scale it had no business going up. Dot Kowalski's Buick pulled in behind me, and she got out in a housecoat and sorrels and stood next to my window and said, I'm calling it in. I said, do it, and I was already walking. I don't remember the walk. I remember the ice on the top step. I remember the door was unlocked, which is the detail I still think about, because Bryce Whitaker was a man who locked everything. The house smelled like bourbon and scorched garlic. I got 2 steps in. My daughter was standing against the kitchen island with one hand flat on the counter, and the other hand up at the side of her head. And there was blood coming down her neck, and into the collar of her scrub top, which she was still wearing, because she'd come home from a 12 at the hospital about 4 hours before. Her earring had been torn out through the lobe, and my grandson was in the hallway in dinosaur pajamas, holding his hearing aid in his fist and looking at the floor. Bryce Whitaker was on the other side of the island with a broken French press in the sink and a dish towel in his hand, and he looked at me and I watched his whole face reorganize itself, front to back, in about a second and a half. Surprise. Then math. Then the friendly open face he'd been wearing at my dinner table for 9 years. He said, Emmett, hey, you're not seeing this right. 34 years and a man in the worst trouble of his life never once told me I wasn't seeing it right. Theo ran to me. He hit me at about knee height and I went down on one knee on the tile, and he burrowed in under my coat, and he was shaking in that deep whole-body way that a kid shakes when he has been holding something for a lot longer than one night. He didn't make a sound. That's what I want you to understand. My grandson cried without making a single sound, and that's a skill, and somebody taught it to him. I held him for maybe 4 seconds. Then Dot Kowalski came in behind me and crouched down and put her hand out flat, palm up, and said, Theo, sweetheart. I have never once in my life been able to work a coffee maker. Come show me. And he took her hand. I stood up. Bryce Whitaker set the dish towel on the counter with great care, like the towel was the thing at risk, and he said, Couples fight. She threw the press at me. Ask her. I looked at my daughter. She was looking at the floor by my feet, and she would not lift her eyes to mine, and that was worse than the blood. He shifted his weight. Just a little, just an inch toward her. And I watched my daughter's shoulders come up around her ears about a half inch and then go back down. A flinch so small it was almost nothing. Nobody in that room would have seen it who wasn't looking for it. That's when the calm came, and I want to be honest about what the calm was. It wasn't wisdom, it was the other thing. It was the sound going out of the room the way it does when you've already made your decision and you're just watching yourself carry it out. I said, "Nora and Theo are coming with me." He laughed. It was a short, ugly bark of a laugh, and it was the first honest noise he'd made since I walked in. She started for the hallway, and he reached out and took her by the upper arm, and my daughter made a small sound. I crossed the kitchen. I am 6'1" and I have arthritis in both shoulders, and I could not have taken that man in a fight on the best day of my life. He was 39 years old and he played hockey twice a week at the Heritage Center. I stopped about 8 inches from his face and I said very quietly, in the voice I used for 34 years, the one that never once went up, "Let go of my daughter." And he did. Then he smiled at me. He put his hands up, palms out, and he smiled, and he said, "What are you going to do about it, Emmett? Call the tower." From the kitchen doorway, without turning around, Kowalski said, "He doesn't have to." The Duluth police took 11 minutes in that weather. 2 cars, no lights, no sirens, which I appreciated for Theo's sake. By the time the officers came up the walk, Bryce Whitaker had completed his transformation. And I need to tell you, that was the thing about him that frightened me most. More than the strength, more than the money. It was the switch. 2 minutes earlier he'd had my daughter by the arm. Now he was standing in his own living room with his hand pushing back through his hair, looking exhausted, looking patient, saying things like, "It's been a really hard year for her. And she hasn't been sleeping with the shifts, and I think her father may have misread the situation. And honestly, I don't blame him." He said it kindly. He said it with sorrow in his voice. The officer who took Nora's statement was a young woman named Talia Brandt, and I've thought about her a lot too. She sat down across from my daughter at that kitchen table, and she didn't take out her notebook right away, and she asked, "Did he put his hands on you tonight?" Nora had a bag of frozen peas against the side of her head. She looked at the doorway. Bryce Whitaker was in the living room, 12 feet away, not looking at her. The pause went on a long time. I've timed pauses professionally. That one was 11 seconds, and my daughter said, "We were both loud." I closed my eyes. Without her saying it, there was no arrest. Officer Brandt explained the options in a level voice, and she explained about a separation for the night. And she explained about the courthouse on Monday, and my daughter nodded at all of it, with the polite glazed attention of somebody being told about a warranty. Then Officer Brandt did something I'll be grateful for until they put me in the ground. She took out a card and she wrote a cell number on the back of it, and she pushed it across the table and she said, "I'm not going to ask you again tonight, but I'm not going to forget your name either." Nora put the card in the pocket of her scrubs. While she packed, he followed her from room to room. Never touched her, never raised his voice. Just talked. "You're really doing this? In front of him? Think about what this does to him. You're going to look back at tonight and you are going to be so embarrassed." Every sentence built by hand. He didn't need to win. He just needed her to run out of gas before he did. At the door, with Theo's backpack in her hand, he changed his whole voice. Went soft and small. "Nora, come on, baby." And I watched my daughter's face open up, just for half a second. That awful familiar swing backward when the person who's been hurting you suddenly sounds exactly like the person you married. Then Theo, standing in the dark hall, reached up and found her hand. We left. The drive back to my house was quiet except for the wipers and the crunch of the tires, and eventually the sound of Theo going under, out cold in the back seat, rung out past crying. Dot's headlights stayed in my mirror the whole way. He fell asleep on my couch under the wool blanket Marianne made the year Nora was born. One hand still curled around that hearing aid. My daughter stood in my kitchen at 3 in the morning staring at the coffee maker like she'd never seen one in her life. I made it anyway. She held the mug in both hands for 40 minutes and never drank a drop. Dot left around 3:45. On the porch, with the ice coming down through the streetlight, she stopped and said, "This didn't start tonight." "No, how long you figure?" I looked through the window at my daughter sitting perfectly still at my table. "Longer than I've been letting myself count." Dot nodded once. She pulled her housecoat tighter and she said, "I'm going to want to look at their paperwork, all of it. The house, the accounts." I said, "Why?" And she said, 30 years, Emmett. Nobody ever hits a woman and steals nothing." I didn't sleep. Around 4:30 my daughter came into the kitchen wearing an old East High sweatshirt she'd left at my house sometime in the last century. And we sat in the dark across from each other for a while. And then she asked me a question I had no defense against. She said, "Do you think I'm stupid for staying? I have talked 211 airplanes down through weather they had no business being in. I have said the right words at the right second to men who were about to die. And I sat at my own kitchen table at 4:30 in the morning and I could not find one single useful sentence in my head. What I finally said was, 'I hate that you had to ask me that out loud.' And that's when she came apart. It came out over the next couple of hours, in pieces, out of order. He went through her phone every Sunday night. He had her passwords for emergencies. He'd taken over the bills 6 years back because she was doing nights and it was easier. He'd start something small before every family event so she'd be off balance and short with people. And then afterward he'd tell her, gently, that everyone had noticed. He told her that with her shifts, if it ever came to it, no court in Minnesota was giving nights and weekends custody of a special needs kid to a woman who wasn't home. Special needs kid, that's how he said it. About Theo. I asked her how long since the first time. She looked at her cold coffee for a while. She said, he was 2, Theo was 2, 6 years. I stood up too fast and I walked out into the garage in my socks and I hit the side of the chest freezer with the flat of my fist, hard enough to leave a dent that is still there, and pain went up my arm into my shoulder like a wire. I stood in the dark and breathed. After a minute Nora was in the doorway. She said, "You never once yelled at Mom, no?" I said, "But I sat at a table with that man for 9 years and never asked you one honest question. Turns out that's its own thing." Kowalski came back at 2 in the afternoon with a hot dish and a legal pad. She's 4'11". She wore reading glasses on a beaded chain. She spread the paperwork out on my dining room table like a woman dealing solitaire. And for 2 hours she barely spoke, and when she did it was to ask Nora questions in a flat, uninterested voice. "When did you sign this? Where were you sitting? What time of day? Was he in the room?" Around 4 o'clock she stopped. She had one page in her hand and she was looking at it the way you look at a word you've spelled so many times it stopped being a word. She said, "Nora, honey, did you sign a quitclaim deed on your mother's house?" Nora said no. Marianne's father built that house in 1961 on the bluff above the Leicester River. And Marianne left it to Nora when she died, free and clear, and it was the only thing in this world I was certain nothing could touch. Dot laid the page down and turned it around and put her finger on the notary block. "That's Halvor Lindgren's seal," she said. "I sat across from Halvor Lindgren for 11 years. He signed 100 depositions in front of me." She tapped the date, and he was dead 4 months before the date on this page. I went to the funeral. It was raining and they parked us on the grass. Nobody said anything. Then Dot said gently, the way you say a hard thing to somebody you like. "There's a home equity line against the house. It's been drawing since March of last year." And my daughter said, "That's not possible. That's not," and stopped, because she was already doing the math and I watched her do it, and I watched her get to the end of it. She looked up at me with her face gone completely white, and she said the sentence that I will hear for the rest of my life. "Dad, the money for Theo's ear is gone. There was a fund. Started at the week she graduated nursing school, before Theo was ever a thought. Every birthday, every Christmas, every holiday shift I picked up in the 8 years after Marianne died, because I could not be in that house at night, and the FAA will always find a man something to do at midnight. Then Theo came along the way he came along, and that fund got a job. Bone and cord hearing device, the surgery, the processor, the audiology, all the parts of it his insurance would only look at sideways. $61,000 over 22 years and a lot of Christmases. Bryce Whitaker had taken 48 of it. He'd done it slowly. Digital transfers. Signature pages buried in the middle of tax packets he'd hand her at 11 p.m. after a fight. When she was so tired she'd have signed her own arrest warrant to make him stop talking. He told her they were rolling it into something with a better return. He used the word fiduciary. He told her she wouldn't understand it and he was doing her a favor. That's the whole trick right there. You don't have to fool somebody. You just have to exhaust them until the cost of understanding is higher than the cost of trusting you. I sat down because my legs had stopped participating. And then something worse than rage came up my throat, and it took me a minute to identify it, and when I did I had to put my hand over my mouth. It was shame. Because I'd loaned that man $11,000 in 2019 and never told my daughter. Because I'd called an old friend at the airport authority to get him a meeting about a commercial parcel. Because he sat at my table every Christmas and ate my food and I liked him. Genuinely liked him. That was the part I couldn't get around. My daughter was clipping coupons and reusing Theo's school folders while that man expensed a suite at Grandview Lodge. Nora said quietly, "You warned me once." I looked up, Thanksgiving, 2 years ago, in this kitchen. You said a man who enjoys embarrassing you in front of people is doing worse when there's nobody watching. I remembered. She'd been loading my dishwasher. He was laughing too loud in the other room. She'd defended him for 20 solid minutes and I had let her, because I didn't want to lose her. She said, "I should have listened to you," and I said, "No, I should have said it louder." Once quietly at a sink doesn't count, that was for me. That was so I could tell myself I'd said something. I want to be straight with you, whoever's listening, because there's a version of this story where I come through that door in Congdon like the cavalry, and it's clean, and it's satisfying, and it isn't true. I got there late. Not that night. That night I was 31 minutes, which was the best anybody was doing on that ice. I mean the other kind of late. I mean 6 years, and $11,000, and a boat conversation at Thanksgiving. Nobody tells you that. You show up eventually, and you do the right thing eventually, and everybody's grateful, and none of it deletes the part where you didn't. It just gets quiet. Dot put us in front of a lawyer named Adrian Falk on the Tuesday. 50s, gray suit that had been good in about 2009, tie a little short. His office was above a pasty shop on First Street and it smelled like it. He listened to the whole thing without writing anything down, which unsettled me until I realized he was watching Nora's hands. When she finished, he took his glasses off. He said, "Ma'am, I want to say a few things and then you can throw me out. There's 4 ways to do what he did to you: physical, emotional, sexual, financial. Most people think the first one is the real one and the rest are complaints. That's backwards. The first one is how they keep you from leaving on Tuesday. The last one is how they make sure you can't leave for the rest of your life." Nora said, "He told me it doesn't matter legally because we're married. Community property." Adrian Falk put his glasses back on. "Minnesota isn't a community property state," he said. "And even if it were, that's not what a forged notarization is. That's not what an aggravated forgery is. And it is absolutely not what taking money out of your child's account is." Then Nora asked the thing that was under all of it, the thing she'd been carrying since 1:04 in the morning on the 14th of February. "If I do this, does he take Theo?" And Adrian Falk sat forward and put both hands flat on the desk and said, "I grew up in a house like yours. My mother stayed until I was 15 because a man in a nice sweater convinced her the judge would like him better." He paused. "The judge did not like him better. I watched her hear it. I watched the door in front of her swing open, and I watched her stand there and not walk through it. If you've ever watched somebody you love stand in front of an open door and not be able to make their legs work, you understand what that hour was. It's not weakness. It's that the man who hurt her spent 6 years making the outside of that door look more dangerous than the inside. That's what all of it is for. Every insult, every dollar, every 11 p.m. signature page. He wasn't building a prison, he was building a fog. Over the next 3 weeks things moved the way real life moves, which is slowly and then in one lump. Kowalski, who has no license and no authority and no business doing any of it, pulled the recorder's records at the St. Louis County Courthouse where she'd worked for 30 years and everybody still called her by her first name. She found the loan officer, she found the closing. She found a second quitclaim on a rental duplex out in Proctor with the same dead man's seal on it. Adrian Falk found the ex-wife. Her name was Meredith Cade, and she lived in Hermantown and she'd been divorced from Bryce Whitaker for 11 years, and she'd never told anyone anything, because when she'd tried in 2013, he'd sat in a mediator's office and cried, and everyone had comforted him. She met us at a Perkins on Central Entrance. She sat down and looked at Nora for a long moment and she said, "Does he tell you that you remember things wrong?" And my daughter put her hand over her mouth. Meredith Cade said, "I'll testify. I've been waiting 11 years for somebody to ask me." Bryce Whitaker, meanwhile, was cycling. "Sorry on Monday, righteous on Wednesday, wounded on Friday. I miss my family. Your father is poisoning you. Theo needs both parents. You know I'd never actually hurt you." Then, on a Thursday, he sent one that I read standing at a quick trip pump on Highway 53 with the nozzle in my hand. "Who do you think is going to want you? A night shift nurse with a broken kid." I put the nozzle back. I got in the truck. I sat in that parking lot for 55 minutes and listened to a man on AM radio talk about the Timberwolves, a team I have never cared about for 1 second of my life, until my hands were mine again. Because here's what you learn at 68 that you cannot know at 39. A decision made at the top of your anger can erase 50 years of a life in about 11 seconds. He wanted me to come to that house. He wanted a photograph of an old man on his lawn. I have spent my whole working life not giving people what they wanted in the moment, so we did it the other way. Adrian Falk sent the deed and the notary date and the county records to the Ramsey County Attorney's white-collar unit, and to the Minnesota Department of Commerce, and to the compliance officer at Bryce Whitaker's brokerage, all inside the same 48 hours. Nobody coordinated it for drama. Nobody made a speech. Paper went where paper was supposed to go. Real consequences don't arrive like weather. They arrive like water in a basement. Quiet from underneath, and by the time you notice it you're standing in it. Officer Talia Brandt called Nora on a Tuesday and said, "You still have my card?" The North Shore Association of Realtors holds its annual awards dinner in March at the Greysolon Ballroom downtown, which is a beautiful old room, gold leaf and plaster, and a ceiling that makes people's voices sound better than they are. 300 people, chicken or walleye, cash bar, a slideshow. Bryce Whitaker had won Broker of the Year 3 times. That night he was getting a fourth, plus something called the Legacy Award, which as far as I can tell is what you give a man when you've run out of trophies. I wore a navy blazer, gray slacks, and the watch Marianne gave me for our 30th. No pins, no department anything. I'd guess half that room figured I was somebody's father-in-law along for the walleye, which is exactly what I was. Kowalski wore purple and sat at a back table drinking a Coke and holding her purse in her lap like a woman waiting for a bus. He came in at 7 with a woman from his office on his arm and worked that room like a man who has never once, not in 39 years, considered the possibility that he is not the smartest person in the building. Handshakes, the big laugh you could hear across the floor. He got a hand on the shoulder of every man he passed. He spotted me at the bar around 8. His face did not do fear, it did annoyance. The specific irritation of a man finding a smudge on his window. He came over with a bourbon already going. Emmett, didn't figure this was your scene. I turned my glass of soda water on the bar. How's the ice out on Greysolon Road? His jaw moved. It wasn't the line he'd been preparing for. That's the whole thing with men like him. They've written both sides of the conversation before they walk over, and the only way to hurt them is to say something that isn't in the script. He leaned in about 4 inches, friendly, for the benefit of the 2 men standing behind him. Nora's not in a good place right now, emotionally. I know you see that. Setting the frame. Laying his version down first so mine would sound like a rebuttal. I said, my daughter's doing better than she's done in 6 years. Something behind his face flickered, and then the good open face came back and he raised his glass an inch and said, well, we all tell ourselves what we need to. And he walked away. He looked back at me twice. By 8:30 the room had changed, and he was the last man in it to notice. 2 of the brokerage's principals had been out in the lobby on their phones for 20 minutes. The woman he'd come with had moved to a different table. He was talking louder and faster, and he'd stopped listening to the answers. At 8:52 they started the awards. They ran his slideshow. Bryce Whitaker at a ribbon cutting. Bryce Whitaker on a job site in a hard hat. Bryce Whitaker with Theo on his shoulders at a Christmas parade, and I had to look at the tablecloth for that one. The MC said his name and 300 people put down their forks and clapped. He stood up. He buttoned his jacket with one hand, which is a thing he practiced. I'd bet money on it. He walked toward the little staircase up to the stage, and he was 3 steps from the bottom of it when Officer Talia Brandt came in from the left side of the room in a dark coat, with 2 investigators from Commerce behind her, and she didn't hurry either. She said something to him that nobody past the second table could hear. He laughed, loud, once. Then he said, about what? And his voice broke in the middle of it, right on the second word, and it went up into a register that nobody in that ballroom had ever heard come out of him, and 300 people heard it at the same time. They cuffed him at the foot of the stairs, in front of the slideshow, which was still running. He looked around that room for somebody to fix it. That's what I remember most. Not his face when they took his wrists, his face while he searched. Every man in that room whose kid's name he knew. And then he found me, and he stopped looking at anybody else. Nora had come in through the side door about a minute before. Navy dress, hair back. She'd worked a 12 the day before and she was standing straight as a fence post. He said her name. She walked over. She stopped about 3 feet from him, closer than I'd have gotten. And the whole room went so quiet you could hear the ice machine behind the bar. She didn't shout, my daughter has my voice. It never goes up. She said, for 6 years I was quiet so you'd be okay. She let that sit. I'm done being quiet. That's all. She turned around and she walked back to her father, and I put my hand on her back and we went out through the kitchen because it was closer. Behind us, a man was explaining to a police officer that there had been a misunderstanding. The legal part took 14 months, and there is nothing dramatic about 14 months. There are continuances. There are hearings that get moved because somebody's kid has strep. There are afternoons in a hallway on a bench with a vending machine coffee. The brokerage terminated him in 9 days. The Department of Commerce revoked his real estate license, and in Minnesota that revocation is permanent, and I read the order twice. He pled out on the criminal side. Aggravated forgery, mortgage fraud, theft by swindle, and the swindle count was the one with Theo's account number in it, printed right there in the complaint in a font about this big. 34 months at Moose Lake. Full restitution ordered, which does not mean full restitution paid, but the court put a number on it. And there is something in me that needed a court to put a number on it. The divorce was final that August. Sole physical custody. Supervised visitation, contingent on completion of a program he has not, to my knowledge, completed. I did not go to the sentencing. Adrian Falk offered to sit with me. Dot said she'd drive. Nora said she'd understand either way. That morning I was standing barefoot in my kitchen at 7 a.m. with a mixing bowl, teaching my grandson to make his great-grandmother's cardamom rolls, which are a lot of work and not actually that good, and which we have made every year since. Theo informed me, with total authority, that cardamom is the second best spice and that first place goes to cinnamon, and that anyone who says otherwise is thinking of nutmeg. I did not argue with him. I spent 34 years watching little green shapes move across a screen, waiting for them to land somewhere safe. I did not need to watch that one come down. I put the money back. Not all at once. A controller's pension is a good pension. It is not a rich man's pension. But between what the settlement recovered and what Adrian Falk shook loose from the equity line and about 18 months of me not going to Florida, Theo's fund came back. He had the surgery in April of last year. He's 9 now. He can tell which direction his mother's voice is coming from, which he'd never been able to do in his life. And the first week he had it, he kept turning around in stores. Nora went to therapy, which she hated, and kept going anyway. She moved back into her mother's house on the bluff, the one that is once again nobody's collateral for anything. 2 winters after that night, I was over there flooding the backyard rink I make for Theo every year, and the storm door banged in the wind and I watched my daughter's shoulders come up around her ears a half-inch and go back down. She caught me watching, and she laughed at herself, out loud, standing in the snow. That's what nobody tells you. Leaving isn't the finish line. Leaving is where they finally hand you permission to start the actual work. She's not fixed. She's not who she was at 25, and she's never going to be. Trust is a house. You can rebuild it, but you'll always know where the fire was. He called once. Last October. Collect from a number I didn't know, and I accepted the charges before I understood what I was doing. He sounded smaller. There was nothing performing in it, which was the strangest part. He said, "Can I talk to her?" I said no. Long silence on the line. Somewhere behind him a door closed on metal. Then he said, "I did love her. You know that, right?" And I stood at the back door and looked out at the ice heaving on the lake in the dark the way it does, groaning like something turning over in its sleep. "I believe you," I said. He started to say something, and I kept going, because I'd had 11 months to think about this, and I only wanted to say it once. "You loved her. And you took the hearing aid out of an 8-year-old's hand and you threw it across a kitchen. Both of those are true. You've spent your whole life thinking the first one cancels the second one." Quiet. "It doesn't," I said. "It never once did." I hung up, no anger, not really any satisfaction either. Just the sound of a door finally closing on a room that should have been shut years earlier. Last summer, out on the rocks below the house, Theo and I were eating popsicles that were losing the fight with July. And he got that look kids get when a serious question is coming. "Grandpa, yeah, Bud, Mom says you saved us." The lake was doing that thing it does in the evening where it goes silver and flat all the way out to nothing. I said, "No." I answered a phone. He thought about that with his whole face for about 4 seconds, the way he does, and then he nodded like I'd handed him something useful, and he went back to his popsicle, and a freighter went by out past the point, and neither of us said anything else for a long time. Here's what I know now that I didn't know at 65. Showing up is not the job. Showing up earlier is the job. We tell ourselves that respecting somebody's privacy is the same thing as protecting them. It is not. It never was. Sometimes love means asking the ugly question at the sink while she's loading the dishwasher, and then asking it again in the driveway, and again at Christmas, and being the pest, and being wrong, and being told to mind your business, and asking again. The man who hurt my daughter did not take her voice. That's not how it works. He taught her that her voice was dangerous. He taught my grandson that the safest thing a person can do is take out his hearing aid and hold it in his fist. I spent 34 years being paid to say the thing the pilot couldn't see, to say it clearly and early and out loud while there was still altitude left. I did that for strangers, thousands of them, people whose faces I never saw. I didn't do it for my own daughter. So let me ask you something, and then I'll let you go. Is there somebody in your life whose visits keep getting shorter and whose explanations keep getting longer? Somebody who's making themselves smaller? Somebody who laughs a half-second too fast when their husband tells a story about them? Don't file it. Don't put it in the shed out back. Ask. And if you're the one on the other side of that, if you're the one listening to this at 2 in the morning because it's the only hour that belongs to you, then find your 4 words. It doesn't matter what they are. It doesn't matter if nobody understands them but one person. Just make sure that one person picks up. And if you don't have anybody to call, look next door. Look at the woman in the housecoat who's been shoveling your walk for 6 years, and you never once asked her in for coffee. She kept court records for 30 years. She never sleeps. She'll be behind you in her Buick before you get to the end of the street. If this one landed somewhere in you, I'd like to hear from you. Drop a 1 in the comments if you think I was right to drive out there through that ice instead of waiting on the police. Drop a 2 if you think I should have said it out loud at that Thanksgiving table, in front of everybody, 2 years before any of it happened. Drop a 3 if the moment you'll carry out of this is my grandson standing in a dark hallway, holding his hearing aid in his fist. And tell me where you're listening from, and what time it is where you are right now. This channel reaches people in places I still have a hard time believing, and every one of those comments is a reminder of why we keep telling these. If you've ever put something away because looking straight at it felt like overstepping, you're not the only one. Not by a long way. Subscribe if you want the next one. There's a new story every week, and every one of them gets told because somewhere out there, somebody needed to hear that they weren't alone in it. I'll see you next time. This is a fictional story inspired by real emotional experiences, fully rewritten and reimagined in Duluth, Minnesota to create original content. Any resemblance to actual people or events is entirely coincidental.